All right, Jimmy, all our previous shoot interviews were only in preparation for this moment right here, where we interview the proprietor of the world's greatest comic shop, Copacetic Comics, Bill Boichel. Bill, I want to thank you for giving us your time and letting us invade your space while we sit here and unpack your brain, all that you have to offer us today.
I'll do my best. It's a deep box with lots of garbage piled on top of it.
One of the super interesting things is that your history with comics and your fandom of comics goes back to the days before there were comic stores. So how did you acquire your earliest comics, or like, pre-direct market? What was that landscape?
Well, I was, basically, as fate would have it, I did live in Pittsburgh. I mean, I'm from New York City originally, but I lived in Pittsburgh from 1964 to summer of '68. And I lived in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood then, and we had an apartment on Northumberland. And in Squirrel Hill was just, an incredible nexus of newsstands. There was the Northumberland Avenue newsstand on Northumberland, the street we lived on. Then there was the Squirrel Hill newsstand on Forbes right off of Murray. And then there was the Murray Avenue newsstand all the way down Murray. And all of them stocked tons of comics. They had big comic racks. I mean, they had really, really good comic book selection. And so that was my youth. I started reading comics so young, I don't really remember the earliest comics I bought, because I literally probably got my first comic when I was 4.
Those questions, what is the first comic you read? That would be for jobbers, but this is the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel,
yeah.
Man, and we're going to unpack much deeper things.
How do you transition from being a reader of comics, Bill, into starting to sell comics, buy, sell, trade? Again, before the direct market, like, what's that look like, and how do you get into that part?
Well, I mean, by the time I actually started selling comics, the direct market had just been created. Because what happened is, after '68, I moved to Washington D.C., and it was like a comics desert, as the people talk about, food desert. There's no supermarkets here. This is terrible. And so in D.C., in the area I lived, there was there was no newsstands that I could walk to or that my parents would take me to. Because they were both busy. I had a younger brother who was a baby, and so I really still had to, my grandparents lived in Pittsburgh, and so I was dependent to some degree on getting them there. And so it was really hard to get comics. It was it was a struggle for me from the early '70s, and then at some point in time, I probably right when the direct market came into being, 74 or 75. Again, I can't pinpoint anything. Someone at school told me that there was a store that sold old comics. And I was like, what? I was like, I couldn't believe it. And I was just like, where? And I was just freaking out. And so I found, the guy told me, and as soon as I could, I took a bus out to Wheaton, and it was called Barbarian Books. And lo and behold, they sold old back issue comics, and it kind of blew my mind. It just never in a million years occurred to me that there would be a store where you could get old comics that, and new comics as well. I didn't realize how much I missed being able to get comics until I walked into that store. And then I think the second I walked in to a store that sold comics, I think something happened in my brain. This is what I wanted to do. Within 5 minutes,
You mentioned DC, and when I think of DC in the '70s, very important names in the history of comics: Gary Groth, Steve Geppi.
Right. Well, Geppi, I think I had a lot more contact with than Gary, but I did like Gary. When I first went to my very first comic show I ever went to, Gary was there hand selling copies of the Comics Journal to the dealers who were set up, and it was a newspaper still then. It was pretty new. This would have been either late '76 or early '77. I can't, the first show I did.
Did you ever go to one of the shows that Gary put together?
No, Metricon was before my time.
Okay.
Gary's, a bit older than me, and so I never went to Metricon. But when he stopped Metricon, a guy named Mark Feldman. Again, it wasn't like Gary handed him the baton or anything, but then, there was he was the next guy to start regularly running shows in D.C. It was called Maryland Funny Book Festival, and I went to those, and I was friends with Mark Feldman, and then this other group that was in Silver Spring, and he had a tiny little store that was somewhat analogous to my original Copacetic. It was just like a hole in the wall. It was like you actually had to walk through 2 other stores to get to this room he had in the back. It was really, I think he told me he paid $100 a month rent. You know, it was really low budget. And there were actually 3 comic book stores in Silver Spring at that time, which was Silver Spring now is like everything in DC is big to do, but it was kind of a lower, much lower rent area back then, and like, you know, this is over 40 years ago.
Let's talk Geppy, or Jeppy as you
call him. I always called him Jeppy, you know. So
for the audience out there, he runs, you know, minority owner of the Baltimore Orioles, but he got that wealth from being, you know, the CEO of Diamond Distribution at this point. So when did you know
Well,
him?
I knew him, again, it is kind of, you know, again, I didn't know him well, but he knew me to see me because I saw him enough. But he, again, we're kind of fast forwarding now, but he bought Mark Feldman's store that the guy I just mentioned, and then he also bought New Media Urjax Distributors, which was also in Silver Spring, and I was, you know, worked with them. They were one of my suppliers. Like, I started out getting stuff from Phil Seuling, but then New Media Urjax was literally in Silver Spring, so I could get wholesale comics from somebody. Like, I could just go right to the place and pick them up, and I had a relationship with that guy, and he, you know, it was the Schuster family. It was a father and 2 brothers, and they were, you know, they have like a kind of bad reputation in the world. I'm not, you know, horrible, but, you know, just, you know, a lot of people had negative things to say about them. But I worked with them, so for better or for worse. But then Jeppy bought out them and bought out Mark, so 2 people I worked with, and both of whom were in Squirrel Hill, Silver Spring, excuse me, but he was still in Baltimore. But he, you know,
it does seem like we're fast forwarding a bit, because was it Geppy who was the mailman?
Well, that was way back when he was a mailman, and he advertised I advertised in the comics. It was called, back then it was called the Buyer's Guide for Comics Fandom, and then later it changed its name to the Comics Buyer's Guide, but originally it was just called the Buyer's Guide. And this was obviously long, you know, 20 full years before the internet came into being, and it was just called, you know, it's an ad zine. It was a newspaper that had nothing in it practically but ads for old comics and related things. I mean, there'd be ads for boxes or eventually, and, you know, and I mean, but that was actually later because there weren't even boxes yet. But
for the record, this is Alan Light's publication?
Yeah, Alan Light. Yeah, exactly. And then he sold it to Krause in the 80s, I think.
So let's talk about Geppy the mailman. How'd you know?
I mean, I only knew him. I didn't actually know him when he was the mailman. I knew him. I saw his ads in the Buyer's Guide, and the thing that struck me is that, like, I mean, you know, who knows what arcane powers Jeppy had to single-handedly go from that to being the sole surviving controller of the comics direct market. It's, you know, someone somewhere will probably at some point do a study like charting, but I think he had, you know, preternatural luck or something, but his prices, you know, he had a very interesting, you know, everybody else would sell comics for like 20 cents, 25 cents, you know, 35 cents, 50 cents, $1, $1.25, but his prices were like 17 cents, you know, 28 cents, you know, 43 cents, or like, you know, $1.16. Like, I couldn't, you know, and I'm pretty sure he had a formula where he just wanted a return on investment. Like, I paid this much and then he would mark it up 30% or 40% or 70% or whatever it was to determine, and he had a very methodical way of dealing with like what kind of return he wanted. I mean, I don't, either that or it was just something so arcane that's beyond human understanding, but that would be my guess. And you know, and then he just happened to buy out the 2 people that I was working with, and I saw him most often, you know, in the context of when he had bought Mark Feldman's store, and I can't even remember, but he just called it Diamond, I guess, at that point. He already had a store in Baltimore, but then he just was expanding rapidly at that point. You know, he bought the distributor, and he bought the, you know, he wanted a store there in Silver Spring, because I guess, I mean, I don't remember in great, but I do remember him like having really great luck. Like, right after he bought Mark's store, someone came in who had been a pressman at World Color Press that printed all the comics, and he worked the press. And, you know, just through sheer chance, like right after Jeppy bought it from Mark Feldman, this guy came to the store to sell them to him, and he had took like, you know, roughly 10 copies directly off of the press of every single comic that was printed, and these were from the 60s, and I remember still like walking up the steps, and because again I know that he remembered me then because I saw me. He said, "Bill, look what I just got," and he just pulled up a box, and it was like Silver Surfer 1, it's like, you know, Iron Man 1, you know, Silver Surfer 2, and they were all like just the whole box, like all perfect mint from right off the press, and I was like, man. You know, and then so he just, you know, I mean, I remember he later got all the foul copies of the Harvey, and then he got the big Warren warehouse that Mark had scored also, and so he, you know, there's definitely some kind of, you know, I think he was just destined, you know, it makes you believe in fate, like Steve Jeppy, you know, so we have decided the power, you know, he will control the Greg market, you know, because like it's just, I would have never in a million years guessed that he would be, you know, everyone else would go out of business and only Steve Jeppy would be left. It's amazing, but I mean, obviously he did something right.
So at this point, you're dealing comics, but you don't have a store.
No, yeah, I did not have a concrete store, you know, in a brick and mortar store until '85.
So
or
what's
'86
that?
actually, the very beginning of '86. But I did comic shows for 10 years and sold through the Buyer's Guide. And so at that time, I would, you know, I had friends, you know, who we would just, it was, you know, I was still I was at my senior year in high school, I guess, and junior year, I guess, but mostly the senior year. You know, we could just travel all over, and I'd be just like, I'll pay for the hotel, I'll pay for the gas, I'll pay for all the food. Let's just go on a road trip, and you guys can do whatever, and I'll sell comics. And they're like, sure, why not? And so we just drove all over creation doing comic book shows. I mean, New York, in Philadelphia, you know, in Baltimore, and of course the D.C. area were the most. You know, and then I did Richmond a bunch of times, and I went as far south as Atlanta. I did a few great Atlanta shows. I was at that Atlanta show, the Atlanta Fantasy Fair, that I think like Stan Lee was there, and Stranko did. Like, I still have the T-shirt that Stranko drew, and I think that was the one that Visions 1 came out at, the first Flaming Carrot, and like Jake, you know, I mean, and that was the period when I was super duper into the studio, which was Barry Smith, Mike Kaluta, Bernie Wrightson, and Jeff Jones, and I went to every show they were at. I was sort of on a borderline groupie of there because I would just hang out at their table anytime I had a chance and talk to them. And yeah, so I mean, that's what I sold at a ton of shows. We drove all over, and I had a knack, you know, and then you could do what would be the regional arbitrage, you know, like I mean, again, I could tell a bazillion stories, but like, for example, you know, some comics didn't get distributed in certain markets as well as others, and in some there were too many. And I remember I guess it was the summer of '78, I was going to, you know, Philadelphia and Atlanta twice that year, and I can't remember exactly. I guess I was in Philadelphia, and they were like Marvel 2-in-1 Annual 2, the end of the Warlock saga by Starlin. It was the very end. No one had it in Philadelphia. They didn't get the proper number. Something happened, and they were selling them for $5. And I'm like, oh man, they had a ton of them in Atlanta. So when I went to Atlanta, they still had them, and they were 50 cents because it had just come out. And so I bought a ton. I knew I was going back to Philadelphia. And so, again, this is peanuts, but it's a 10 times markup. I got them for 50 cents, and I knew I could sell them for $5. And so, you know, and that was like, those are the kind of wacky things you could do if you were paying attention and traveling all over. And, you know, and that was the year, too, that I can't remember, you know, either 77, 78. The two things that I was really thought were, I thought were really hot or really wanted to buy. I was sort of hoarding and speculating in were the Marshall Rogers, Steve Englehart Detective Batmans, and then the new X-Men. And at the very beginning, I thought these are the two good things, and then, you know, it sort of emerged relatively quickly within a year that the X-Men were getting hotter, and when I would go to these shows, like the first thing I would do is I'd have my buddy, we'd set up and I'd say, watch the table for half an hour, and I'd go around the room and buy every single new X-Men that every dealer had. Like, I just figured, I mean, I know it's kind of predatory, but again, I was a kid, and I was just like, I'm going to do this. This is the way to make money. And I just bought all the new X-Men in the room, and I was the only one who had them, and then I would just mark them up. I wouldn't mark them up ludicrously, but I was, you know, I just wanted to be the person that had them, and I was, you know, holding on to them, you know. But then, of course, I built up a huge stock, but then sold it all like way, way, way before they became hugely valuable.
One more while we're sticking with this early period, because you did mention the name Phil Soling, and for those of those of you at home who don't know the name, this guy created the direct market, basically.
Right.
Did you have connection with him?
Well,
did
he
you
was
order from him.
Yeah, Phil Suling, because he was the only one at the beginning. It was just him.
Yeah.
You know, like he was the one who invented the direct market. You know, for people who don't know the history of of comics, comics were distributed through the newsstands. Like I said, when I was a kid, I went to the newsstand and got comics. They were distributed just like Time Magazine or Glamour or what People Magazine or what didn't exist then. But you know what I mean. Regular magazines, comics just went with them. They were sold on the newsstand, sometimes to supermarkets, sometimes in those little packs that you probably hear about, the three for packs. Those were usually at supermarkets or toy stores, but almost all of them were sold through newsstand distribution to newsstands, and they were sold on a returnable basis for a lower discount. And so probably anybody who's been collecting a long time has seen comics, A, coverless, but B, with the logo missing. Like you see, it's the whole cover, but then there's a neat tear and the logo's missing, because that's how returns worked. You just had to rip off the logo at least, and then you put them all in an envelope, and then you return them for credit. And so in theory, the big thing is that the comic book publishers didn't know how many copies they sold until 2 to 3 months later when the returns came back. And so, for example, let's just say they print, back in the day they'd print, let's pick a really good title and say they printed, 500,000 copies is how many they would print. They have to overprint because they have to have enough at every newsstand. But then when they come back, maybe 100,000 copies come back returned, maybe 200,000, maybe 300,000. They just don't know what the actual sales are until they come back. And so there was always like a time lag in terms of like that, when a title got canceled, the sales started going down, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of different factors. But the big thing is they didn't know how many they were going to sell. And for, just to do one quick aside, when the Comics Code came in, and a lot of people were super angry at William Gaines because they thought his sarcastic testimony at the Kayfabe committee hearings, was counterproductive, and some of the distributors were angry, and so they took all the EC comics and didn't distribute them to the stores, and then returned 100%. And so like he would print 500,000 copies, and then he didn't know until 2 or 3 months later what was happening, and then they all came back, and then he had to immediately go out, stop publishing.
Describe Suling's innovation.
Okay, and so then what Suling did, his innovation was right around the time, when the early 70s, late 60s to the early 70s, comic book stores like the one I mentioned started springing up to sell old comics, and this was a whole new thing. And then for them, like, old comics were something they wanted to keep in supply, not because they might go up and they might have value and they might be collectible, and they could, and then Phil Suling's like the little gears, like were going in his head, and he was like, hey, like these people they don't want to return the comics, they want to keep them, and they might go up in value. And so, and he saw that there were the stores already existed, but they were just getting them through the newsstand. And I'm gonna, I was just gonna say that the newsstand discount is probably something along the line of 30%. I don't know, I'm sure there's a variable depending on how big you are, et cetera, et cetera. But let's, for the sake of argument, say it was 30%, but then you could return them. And then so Suling, and then then the people who were the newsstand distributors themselves probably got it for 40% off, and so 60 cents on the dollar went to Marvel and DC, something like that. I'm sure I'm wrong, but it's, for the point of this illustration. And so Phil Suling said, what if I buy the comics from you and they're on a non-returnable basis, but you give me a bigger discount in exchange? And then, so they went back, and he said, like, I'll get them from you for 60% off and sell them to the stores for 50% off, or, between 50 and 40. But then there are no returns. And so, I mean, make a long story short, they said, sure, we'll give that a shot. And so that was the birth of the direct market, was the fact that they were not returnable for a bigger discount. And, and that was the big innovation. That one idea gave birth to the entire direct market. And so, and that would have been in '74. And, flash forward to '86, when, that was the big watershed year in comics, when, Dark Knight came out, and Watchmen, and, and then, I mean, just those are the two big ones, but then also like Mouse, Love and Rockets, American Flag, and others got a lot of press in the mainstream, and people started going to comic book stores. And I mean, I don't know the exact date, but right around that period, the direct market eclipsed the newsstand, and then the newsstand just became almost, there's like an X. Like the newsstand was like 100%, and the direct market was 0. And let's say 1986 was the X, when then the newsstand kept going down and the direct market kept going up.
Before we get into like the direct market as a thing, I just am very curious, and I want to get on the record just your relationship with Suling. Like how did you order from him early?
Yeah, I mean, he would send, everything was on paper. He would just have these just the order pack, and it would just be real simple. It would just be real small type with lots of real narrow lines, so you could stick as many on each piece of paper, and it would just have the title and an issue number, and then it would have like the price, and then and then you might even have to manually calculate the discount, and then it would be the number that you were ordering, and then you would, you just do it all on pencil, and how much you would owe, and then it would add it all up, and you'd get that once a month, and it'd be like a couple pieces of paper would be in a manila envelope, and there might be a colored sheet with some instructions or something, and like, hey, and it was, it was really, really minimal. I mean, it would have been, 2 sides of a piece of paper, and weren't that many comics. It was like, I can't remember. It was almost all just Marvel and DC, from Suling. I mean, I don't even remember if he distributed like Archie or Harvey. I honestly don't remember. He might have.
And this was called Seagate. When you were
No, it was called Phil Suling. Seagate was later.
Okay.
Seagate, he didn't change it till he was just Phil Suling because he was the only guy.
Yeah. And
then at some point, he was the only one for like maybe 2 years, and then other people started coming in. Like New Media Urjax was one, and then there was, Bud Plant was another person I dealt with, and I also dealt with Last Gasp, but they didn't do Marvel or DC. They did the smaller press, like the ground level comics, like they did Star Reach and Quack, and of course Last Gasp did the undergrounds, and then they did portfolios and posters, and then Suling, and then it became a little bit more complicated. But then competition started by the the late 70s, and then once you got into the 80s, I'm sure at some point there was at least a dozen distributors at some point, and then the black and white explosion had a shakeout because it was a ripple, because stores ordered too many, couldn't pay for them, and then they couldn't pay the distributor, and then it was the domino effect, and a bunch of guys went out then in the late 80s. But yeah, Suling at the beginning was just Phil Suling. I don't remember. I think he changed the name to Seagate around 1980. I might be wrong. My memory is not that good, but it was 100% just Phil Suling at the beginning.
Bill, you told a story recently about doing a show in New York City. I wonder if you could recap that story.
All right. Well, this is I guess this is one of my most famous war story that I've told a million times. Is when I moved, I was in DC, and I had my crew that drove me everywhere, and I had just moved to Pittsburgh, and then the Creation Con, I'd already bought a table, and that was in 1978, I guess this was. Creation Con was the #1 show. Like San Diego Con was still small. It used to be Phil Suling's show was the biggest, and it was this 4th of July, or around there, and then he kind of took over from the con that was the Marvel Con, and then Phil Suling ran. He might have even been the guy who ran it, but then Creation got a little bit bigger. It was on Thanksgiving weekend, and the tables were astronomically expensive by the standards of the day, and so I had already bought it, and then I realized, when I was going, I couldn't get anyone to take me there, and I couldn't, and so I was like, how am I going to get there? And so I was like, I guess I'm going to have to take the bus with all my comics, and so, again, it was just like, I had to, and back then they had something. There were checker cabs. People who aren't old enough won't know what a checker cab is, but it was like the most famous cab. If you ever watch an old Hollywood movie and you see all the cabs in New York, they're all checker cabs, and they're really big, and they have pop-up seats in the middle, so like you can seat 3 or 4 in the back seat, but then there's a pop-up seat. There's a big space where extra people, like they used to do, where people would just pick up people on the cabs. Like once I was in a checker cab with like 12 people in it, like, hey kid, come in, and there was just like some people were all alcohol, drunk. That's another story. But anyway, because it had such a big space where the pop-up seats were, it was just big enough to put long boxes. It was just freakishly that it was. I thought it would be, and it was. And so I called a cab. They came, and I carted all the long boxes into the cab. I filled it up with long boxes, and then he took me to the Greyhound station. And I went to the Greyhound station and said, I got to put these on the bus.
How many boxes are we talking?
12.
12 long boxes.
12 long boxes, I think. Yeah, whatever, like one table.
About
It's probably
books.
12 long boxes.
About 4,000 comics.
So yeah, I'm sure it was right around that. Again, it had to be, because like I would have brought as much as I could to fit in this table, and I always put a couple underneath. And so then the guys at the Greyhound was like, we can put them on the bus, but they won't get there till Tuesday or whatever. And I was like, no, they have to go on my bus. Well, that's not how it works. Like, you just ship them, you know. And then we was like, no, they have to be on the bus with me. And I was, you know, I can't remember exactly, but I just went on. I said I told my whole story, like what I was doing, like why I needed it, like what was going on. And, you know, these are probably union guys, and they're like, we have to do it by the book. You can't do it. But I kept at it and kept at it and kept. I said, like, I have to, like, you know, I just like I was just sort of like, I have to. And eventually, I guess they just, you know, either were worn down or just gave me props for being so persistent that they said, okay, they do it. And then they did. And they put them on the bus. And then, you know, I got to New York. And then, of course, I had to get them on. I mean, those guys, I gave them to them in the shipping thing, and then they put them on the bus. But then when I got them off the bus, I guess somebody, and then they just put them, and I was in the Port Authority in New York, which if you've ever been there, it's just this giant thing, and there's a million people going back and forth, and I'm like, oh my God, I got all these comic boxes, and then I had to like carry them. They put them on the thing, and I just had them in the hallway, and people are going like, but like I had to get to the front door where the cabs were, and like, how am I going to do this? Like, I mean, I probably like gave somebody a couple bucks, like, can you just watch these? And then I would just carry one at a time. Then I got can you just watch these? And I had to run back and forth to get them to the front. And then I was trying to get a cab, and nobody would pick me up because they saw I had all these boxes. And then I yelled like, double fare, and then somebody, double fare, okay. And then the double fare guy took me, and so I went to the hotel, which I think was the Statler Hilton, which is, you know, I think across the street from Madison Square Garden. And then I was there, and then the union guys there were like, we have to charge you like $1 a box to carry them to the thing or whatever. And I remember at this point, this is long enough, but I mean, I think I gave the guys like a tiny joint, and then they were like, okay, you're in. You know, it was like, so, and then that's cool. And then so they took it all into the room for me, and then that was a crazy show because that was like that's you know, that particular show, because I was by myself then, and then I was put on a floor because it's the Macy's Day Parade, okay, and so there was just all these high schoolers, you know, from all over the country who were going to march in the parade, and I was near you know, where a whole bunch of high school students were. And I think I must have brought a radio or something, because like I was just playing it, and then like somebody, like the chaperone, like, turn that radio off, and I'm like, I'm not with the school. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. But then it turned out then later, Aerosmith was playing at Madison Square Garden, and they were supposedly also in the hotel. And because of my appearance, you know, I was tall, like, and had real long hair. Somehow some of these people thought I was. I mean, again, like some of the high school students, are you with Aerosmith? What room is Stevie Tyler in? And this all happened at this. You know, it was just like a really nutty show. But then I did well at the show. I could, you know, whatever. I mean, I could talk about the show. But then I got them, and then I had to do the whole thing in reverse and got them. But I did, and it wasn't as big a deal getting them on the bus coming back, because I wasn't as desperate also. Yeah. But in New York, they were like, yeah, that's no problem. Like, whatever. Like, you just put it on. Maybe I had to pay extra. I don't remember. But I do remember then when I got back, because it was a midnight bus too, so I probably didn't get on the bus, and it was like at midnight. And I might take the midnight. I must have taken the midnight bus both ways. But I remember then it was snowing, and then I got back, and I was like, and that's right. I remember because it was Thanksgiving, leaving New York. So many people were in line that it was 4 buses. Because like I was real focused on getting the comics on. And then, there was just, the line was forever. And so I think I got on the 4th bus, like one after another. They were just filling up. And when I got to Pittsburgh, I saw, as I pulled in, that my comics were sitting on a dolly out in the thing, all covered with snow, because they had been put on the 1st bus. And so, then it was like, and then I managed to get back. But then I put them back, and I got back to the house, and then I had immediately to go to class. But that's what young is being about. Like, you can do that and not keel over.
It's amazing, man.
All right, Bill, you mentioned opening your first store, mid-'80s.
Yeah, well, I mean, should I make any digression to the filmmakers, or just we'll just skip that?
This is Cartoonist Kayfabe.
Okay, but so what I did, because I had a brief thing where I worked at filmmakers, and then I decided I wanted to try to combine some of the stuff I learned there, and I did a year of monthly shows, and I created this thing called BEM, which was, in large part inspired, it was a tip of the hat, a kudos, what's the word? You know, an honor to homage what to you know, Gilbert Hernandez's story in Love and Rockets 1, because Love and Rockets was probably the single most, you know, important reason why I got back into comics, because I sort of drifted away. But then I saw Love and Rockets and I was like, oh my God, this is what comics could be. Like, I'd given up, you know, and then that renewed my faith, was that. And of course the term BEM predates, you know, it's not like he didn't, it goes all the way back to the 50s, and I won't bore people with, you know, the whole thing, but, you know, that had to do with it. So I created an umbrella organization called BEM, and I ran a show called Transfer that I did, you know, for all of 1985 every month, and I did a publication called Transformer. It was all very high concept that we gave away every month. And then, you know, I decided to open a store, and that was just called, technically it was BEM Presents the Store, because BEM already existed as this thing, but everybody called the store BEM, you know, but it was technically the store. And so that was in Wilkinsburg. I had already moved to Wilkinsburg. I ran the whole BEM operation out of this gigantic 5,000 square foot warehouse. You know, sort of like, you know, Warhol had the factory, I had the warehouse, and there was lots of stuff went on there, but I guess we won't talk about it. But then I opened, you know, the store in the beginning of '86. You know, I moved to that warehouse at the end of '84, like straight from filmmakers. And again, you know, it was, you know, Wilkinsburg, you know, it was a number of reasons, but like that store location was right at that point. The East Busway, you know, the Martin Luther King East Busway was fairly new, and it terminated in Wilkinsburg 1 block from where I opened the store, and that was part of it. It was real convenient on the bus, and there were other buses that went there. And I mean, it was a huge space, and it had a full basement that was also huge, and the rent was dirt cheap because it was in Wilkinsburg. And so that's, and I, you know, at that point I opened an account with Capital City, and I think I did Capital City the whole time until they went under, which I can't even honestly remember anymore if they went under after I closed BEM or not. It's a bit of a blur.
I think it was after.
Yeah,
What year did you close?
95.
Yeah, maybe
That was all when it was starting to go down, where that whole Heroes World and the whole thing was a giant clusterfuck. And,
yeah, we'll be getting into that on some future Wizard episodes.
Yeah, and so, but I think I had, you know, Capital City for the...
And that's the only one that you used at that point in time?
For the monthly comics. You know, obviously I still had an account. I had an account with Last Gasp and by Plant, and I even bought stuff direct from Stranko. And, you know, even then I was just dealing with anybody I could get, you know, variety. You know, it was never just them. You know, I would, and I... Sure. But, it was...
I asked that because
it's different.
It's 1985, so the Turtles came out '84. They're catching buzz, and there's slowly going to be this trickle effect of black and white publishers coming out, and you know,
yeah, well, they opened it to a whole different I don't want to say like demographic, you know, because the black and white, you know, obviously Fantagraphics did Love and Rockets, and they also then at that point had Neat Stuff and Lloyd Llewellyn, and there had been, you know, obviously the Undergrounds that were black and white, and then there was the Star Reach things, and there was a, you know, so black and white. Of course, there were the Warrens throughout all the 70s, which was like,
yeah,
of course.
We're talking post
right,
Turtles.
Right, but I mean, I'm just saying, black and white meant adult.
I see.
And it meant mature readers, and it meant more challenging material. That black and white equaled that. You assumed that, okay? And then the Turtles changed it, because these guys and all the ones who followed them was like black and white equaled cheap production, big profits for us, and like have an idea makes the money, and then that opened the floodgates to what became known as the black and white explosion, because then people were just like, I can have a goofy idea. And of course, you know, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, then there were all these ones like, I can't even remember, but the Intergalactic Koalas, and then there was like Fish Police, and then there was like, you know, Black Belt Adolescent Hamsters, you know, obviously just punning on that. You know, some of it was just super silly. And of course there was Cerebus also, it precedes all that. I mean, Cerebus goes back. I mean, I bought Cerebus 1 from Dave Sim at one of those New York shows. He was going around just like with Gary, just selling them to dealers. Like, I'll take 3, sure, whatever. I liked him from, he did the Beavers and Quack.
Yeah, he did.
You know, anyway, so that's what changed, is that black and whites suddenly were anything goes, and then people just piled in, because again, this is the thing about the direct market, that, you know, that for a small player, the direct market, the fact that nothing was returnable, like you could do a dummy, you know, a Xerox or what have you, you know, give it to the distributor, and at that point, they would take anything. They pretty much, because there was, again, this is early in the game. Like, yeah, we'll put it on the list and see how many people order it. Whatever. And so, and then you knew what your printing bill was going to be to print, like, black and white comics. And once we're at the mid 80s, there's, I think, probably 2,000 direct market stores or thereabouts. Then it went up to 3 or 4 at the peak, and then it came back down. But so let's just say there's 2,000 direct market stores, and everybody orders one. Because at that time, even I was like, well, I got to order one of everything. I mean, I can't not have it. Like, I don't know what it is. So everybody would order one. So you're selling, 2,000, even if everybody orders one. And that's way more than enough to break even on a black and white comic. So you're already making money if every store orders one. And people just sort of like, ding. And then people just started to pile in. It's like, I did my comic. I made X dollars. I don't know if you make, because these are younger people. If you're doing this and you're doing a comic, and some of them, they're not really working that hard on some of them, right? They're obviously, some, just like anything, some are better than others, but some are kind of garbagey. Some are really garbagey. And, people are just like, I just did my comic, I made $1,000 or whatever, and that's incredible, and just like, I'm going to do that too. Like, what do we do? And then people, you can just imagine young guys just like, I'll do one, whatever, like trucks, they're on fire. Okay, fire trucks, like whatever. And, any kind of idea that you could think of, and then we would get them, and then it took a while before, you were, somebody like in my position was like, wow, there's so many. Even if I order one of everything, and then you're adding it up, like, that's a lot of money when you get all this, and then some people, then you sort of had to make calls, and at a certain point you just realize, like, you had one of everything, but then there's all these ones you got one of that nobody bought, and then you sort of have to decide, like, what am I going to miss? But then what if I miss the one that's the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? And that was what drive people not to miss it. And then some people would like, that looks good, I'll get 20, and then you might sell 0. And so that was the black and white explosion. And, it was real challenging for dealers because they're not returnable. And then suddenly there was all this product. And, like, again, you have to add it all up. And, like, if you sold $10,000 worth of new comics that month, and then the order pack comes in, and if you order your normal things and then one each of all the black and white comics or whatever, or you try to do it and then you work out the retail value of that and it's $12,000, then chances are you're going to be stuck with product. And so you had to be careful. And some people didn't do those calculations and just were overly optimistic and thought, yeah, this is going to be big, or trusted their own judgment of what the next hot thing was. And then when at a certain point suddenly they were wrong, couldn't pay their bills, and then couldn't pay the distributor, and then because they couldn't pay the distributor stopped sending them the comics, and then they went out of business, and then the distributor never got paid for the ones that they had sent, and some of the weaker, poor cash flow, smaller distributors then, ripple domino effect, went out of business. And that was the black and white explosion.
Publishers and
yeah, and then of course the publishers, then nobody would take them anymore.
I have a couple of questions out of all this, Bill. So first, we hear about a lot of distributors. Were there 15 or 20 distributors at this time? Like, are most of those small regional operations?
Yeah, there were regional ones. There were some in Canada for sure. There were Canadian independent ones. Because I remember when I was desperately trying to corner the market on Love and Rockets. I wanted to buy every Love and Rockets there was, and only the big stash I found was in Canada. And I was like, oh wow, I'll take them all. This huge box from Canada. But I don't know, 15 or 20. Again, I really can't pretend to remember. I mean, I would say a dozen. I feel comfortable saying that there were a dozen distributors at one point, more than that. Somebody out there, there's a record. I'm sure there's some,
right.
Some thing where you look in there's some piece of paper where they have, the distributor convention, and here's all the people to be represented. And I was like, oh, there they are. I'm sure there's documentary evidence, but I don't remember for sure.
Yeah, I wonder, we see the list of names, but I wonder, like, if those are really viable, if they were full service, things like that. If there were 2 or 3 that everybody was kind of picking
well, no,
between.
some people, I mean, there was, again, like, people, I'm sure that the regional was a big part of it, because then the trucking, like if you were serving your region. I remember, like, Friendly Frank's, like, I got stuff from him. He was in, I can't remember if he was in Minnesota or Illinois or something. He's still around. He actually ordered something for me, I think, But he was like, he's the guy I always remember, because he was, to the best of my knowledge, at least for me, he was the one who introduced polypropylene bags when everyone else still had polyurethane bags, and it was Friendly Frank. And he might not be the one who did it, but in my perception, for me, he was. And so, like, I bought some from him. Oh my God, these bags are so much better. I'm only buying from you. And then he would just have his van, just one of those giant step vans, and it would just be floor to ceiling filled with polypropylene bags. And then he would just drive around, and I would buy, I'd buy thousands at a time. I probably bought 10,000 at a time from him to get the better rate. And then he would just drive them, and I'd talk to him. And, I bought some, comics. I probably bought like 11, but I don't think he was never my regular distributor though.
Can we talk bags for a second?
Yeah, man, hit it.
Yeah,
the smartest guy in the business.
He is the inventor of the bag. That's the running joke on the Kayfabe channel. The guy who invented the poly bag is the single richest person. So tell us about the origin of that. When did you first see these things?
Well, I remember at the very, very beginning, like when I very, very first started, it was hard to get comic bags. And again, my memory is not great, but I remember either that they were hard to get or they were really expensive, because I remember buying bags that weren't comic bags because either it was the only thing I could get or they were a lot cheaper, and they would be clear on one side or printed, and I would fold them around. They'd be too big, anything just to put them in, to have them in the boxes so they wouldn't get damaged. And I remember, this is at the very, very beginning. I remember at one point I had bags that were like light green.
Yeah, the green ones.
Yeah, and then I remember I had bags that they were perforated at the fold for whatever reason, either to make it fold easier. That was the idea, because then you could just fold it over instead of having to pinch it or tape it. And I remember those were ones that I had, and then they were all polyurethane. And then once you're doing this long enough, they're in the bags, and you realize, oh, these polyurethane bags start, some of them just get slimy, and then they turn brown or yellow, and then some of them were terrible. Like, they would really interact with the acids in the newsprint, and at some point, I kind of noticed this, but then at some point, somebody started writing or talking about it was actually bad and damaging the newsprint. It was actually bad for your comics to put them in these. And I'm like, oh, what do you do? But like, you can't display them in the box without a bag in the back. If it's an expensive comic, you can't just stick it in there. And so you just, I would just be changing bags all the time. Like, you had to just throw them away. And then it was just like again, this is like the most boring thing in the world to anybody, but it was just like running like a machine shop or whatever. You just have to you ding 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 ding, and you just have to be rebagging. It was just part of the ritual. You'd have to go through and pull out all the ones that were bad and look. But then when polyurethane or polypropylene was introduced, they didn't turn yellow and slimy, and they were much better. I mean, I think I went through the entire shop and just chucked out all the polyurethanes and put them all in polypropylenes. But then, even those they would pucker. I mean, again, this is totally the most ridiculous nerd thing to talk about of all time.
It's the channel.
But and then I can't remember. Bill Cole and Ernst Gerber were the two guys who introduced Mylar, and it's probably Bill Cole who did it first. He was from New England, but Ernst Gerber, he's the guy who made those incredible cover guides that the A through K and then L through the giant photo guides, the comics that had the cover of every comic ever printed. You don't have that? Oh,
I'll put it on my list.
Oh my God! Okay, well, that was the big deal. But
this part.
Kayfabers, PO Box 3071.
E. Gerber, the second one, he did two more that were just Marvel, but the first two were incredible. Had every cover of every comic that came out, and it was just people were, it was his quest. He drove all around the country, and there was a few he didn't get, and so they were blank squares, and then he was going to find them, and then he'd send the people stickers, and they'd put them in in a stamp.
That's fun.
Because it was incredible. But so he's from Baltimore, and his business I think is now owned by Jeppy. But I remember at the beginning I bought from Bill Cole, but then at some point I switched to, I think maybe Gerber invented the My Light, and Bill Cole was the one who did the Mylar Snug, like Snug TM. I think Bill Cole might own that trademark. But those guys, they were the the Coke and Pepsi or the Diamond Capital of the Mylars.
The way we'll end it though is you've been ordering bags on the phone. You call somebody up, and you've been talking to the same lady.
Oh, at Gerber.
20 years. Really?
Yeah. She just answers for 20 years in the Baltimore warehouse, and and so she's just for the My Lights. That's all I get from Gerber is the My Lights. But yeah, supplies were a big thing. The boxes. And then they suddenly started making comic boxes, and then there were the acid-free boxes, and then there's this and that. But some guy. It might have been Frank, who I probably bought boxes from him too. But then of course at the very beginning, Capital and Diamond did not sell supplies at the very beginning, but soon thereafter they did, But then they all, But Capital, I think, was more into the supplies. They had their logos on them in the bags and everything. But then, blah, 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 blah. Now I get emails from China. We can sell you, you know, and the prices they quote are like incredibly cheap. But I'm like, I don't, you know, I mean, if I was still doing that kind of business, I'd probably be ordering them direct from China. But I don't any longer. You know, my main thing is the high-end collectibles, which I put into Mylar. You know, and the thing, I mean, Mylar was invented by DuPont for the U.S. government to preserve documents, and is completely inert and doesn't interact with paper at all. And so, anybody out there, if you have comics, you know, like from before 1980 that are newsprint and that you want to preserve, like, you know, for many, many years, and that you think might become valuable, and you really, really, really should put them in Mylight or Mylar, and then have a 100% acid-free back, or not. You don't have to have a back if other people aren't looking through them. But you know, Mylar is inert and will not interact with the paper. Like plastic, even polypropylene will interact with newsprint and degrade its quality and turn it acidic. And you know, Mylar won't. So like, if you have like, you know, Giant Size X-Men 1 in a plastic bag, that's stupid. You know, it should be in a Mylar. I mean, I guess everybody now has them in CGC, but I don't know enough about that to know if maybe that's hurting your comics too. I don't know.
It's good that we have that on the record.
Yeah. The other piece that I wanted to ask about, Bill, you're talking about the 80s and sort of this dilemma of you want to have one of everything because who knows, you don't want to miss out on the next Turtles book or whatever. Depending on how business savvy the shop owners are, some were getting in trouble over this kind of practice, ordering more than they were selling, things of this nature, Business 101. We've come across like Marvel doing initiatives to get stores cash registers in the early to mid 80s. So implying that, you know, some of these
they were so low tech. Exactly. They would have a shoebox with cash. Right. Yeah.
And I wonder, like, what kind of stuff were you seeing? Very predatory practices from some guys who were more business savvy that were able to walk into this environment and sort of take advantage, maybe.
I mean, I gotta be honest. Like, I mean, I don't doubt there was some of that, but I mean, my experience that there was not really super shady, that kind of thing in comics so much like you might see in other entertainment industries. Because, you know, I mean, again, I've worked a little bit in film, a little bit in the music, making records, and comic book people are always more honest, you know, nicer, more friendly than any other business that I've been in. You know, so I mean, I'm sure there was some, but I didn't. And also, I think maybe somebody talking to me would know pretty quickly that I wasn't going to be the person they were going to get over on. But I don't recall anything like, you know, and again, the internet didn't exist, and so I might have got stuff in the mail, and I might have just tossed it, you know, things that, I mean, the main thing is that people would encourage you. I mean, everything was like, buy more, this is going to be incredible, you know, and you know, to be honest, like, once all these small presses started to come into being, that is what prompted Marvel and DC to introduce Baxter paper, and particularly introduce Baxter reprints, because they wanted to flood the market with their product to suck dollars away from the independents. So, like, look, you can get all these famous, you know, like Green Lantern, Green Arrow, Warlock, Captain Marvel, you know, this Englehart Rogers Batman, and on and on and on. They reprinted them all on Baxter paper, and they were $2 at a time when comics were probably 75 cents, 60, 65, 75 cents at that time. And then they did the New Gods, but then at least that New Gods 6 had the new Kirby story in it, which was incredible. So, I mean, I guess it's now reprinted in those tradebacks, but at the time you had to buy that New Gods reprint number 6 to get, what was that, like, Armageddon, I think the story was. Anyway, so Marvel and DC were pushing, they were trying to figure out ways, and they did that again in the 90s, where they started flooding the market with these, you know, pretty poor quality stuff. Some of it was reprints from England, just anything that they could think of, and that was just them trying to suck the oxygen out of the room, because thinking people, like, they're gonna have to buy every Marvel comic, they got to get at least one of every Marvel and every DC, and you know,
market share, right?
Yeah, it's all about,
you know, Wizard prints pie charts every month,
right,
of you know, all the different publishers, at least the big publishers, and what their percentages are. And it feels like a lot of those practices are designed to get the biggest pie piece, as opposed to get new readers or...
Well, they were exactly, I mean, but it was even beyond that. They just wanted to crush, like, First Comics and Eclipse and Pacific and all these other ones that, you know, they just saw them as a threat. And of course, they also gave creator rights, and that upset them. And that's why they, eventually had to start giving royalties, and they courted Miller to get him, for Marvel. They gave him Ronin, where he could have carte blanche and have some ownership of it, because, that's, but that only happened because of the competition from these independents, because the people would be like, of course, then Miller went to Dark Horse, to do most of the rest of his work, because, it's a better, you have all the ownership. And so, but they didn't like that. I mean, because it's just like, everybody was work for hire. We own everything. We can do what we want, and then they had to suddenly start giving royalties and had to give some kind of rights and reprint things. Like, that only happened after the direct market and the competition from the independents. Like, it probably wouldn't. I mean, if that hadn't happened, that's probably the part they never occurred to them when they said yes to the direct market. Like, oh man, maybe that was a mistake. But of course, the direct market unquestionably saved comics for sure, because the newsstand sales were tanking, and DC was in dire straits at the end of the 70s. And so, yeah, the direct market, by giving birth to the independents, who then started to come in to take advantage of that non-returnable thing. Again, we kind of jumped all the way from Phil Seuling to the Black and White Explosion, and there's a whole big period in between there.
I'm really curious if you speculated on Cerebus in the same way as you did, like, the X-Men and even Fantasy Quarterly with the Elf Quest.
No, I didn't really, but the honest thing is, I wasn't like a huge fan of it. Like, I actually really liked the Marshall Rogers Detective. Right. And I really liked the new X-Men, and like, I thought Cerebus was okay, but it was like a blatant just parody of Barry Smith's Conan. He was just trying to, and I actually, I like the Beavers better than Cerebus. But then, like, later Cerebus got better, and then then he went into a whole nother direction. But but then when again, like I said earlier, like, Love and Rockets was the ones like, oh my god, this is it. Like, it just, it was the one for me. I also really liked Flaming Carrot, because I was sympathetic, because it was kind of like Dada, surrealist, super bizarre, and that was early. The Flaming Carrot Killian Barracks was like 81, and then I think the Art of Mark Vanheim was 84, and so that was, right in the, same time that Love and Rockets came out, and Flaming Carrot was just so weird, at the beginning. It was just like, it was just the weirdest thing, and it was very savvy about the comic book people. The comics, Bob Burton was very knowledgeable about Golden Age, and just, he was a total comics geek, and his stuff, it was imbued with comic booky. And then I like Reed Fleming, and then Neat Stuff, and Lloyd Llewellyn, and then later 8-Ball. But none of, I did buy huge quantities of all that stuff, but it wasn't, at that point, I have to be honest, like, my total mercenary stage of comics kind of was over. When I started BEM, I was kind of reformed. I because of my experience in the independent arts community, filmmakers, and blah blah blah, I suddenly much more saw comics as an art form. And again, and then once I saw the Love and Rockets, it really was, again, I say it 100, I can never say it too much. I really saw, like, oh, you can do this with comics. You can take the vocabulary of all the superhero stuff and all the fantasy stuff, and then use it to tell personal stories that have a whole another layer of meaning that aren't exploitative, and blah 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 blah. And so I no longer really speculated in the sense of, like, trying to buy a whole bunch to make lots of money. Like, I stopped doing that. I really literally never did it again to that sense. I would buy a ton of it because I just didn't want to sell out. Even when, like, I remember, just to give an example, later when Killing Joke came out, that was after Dark Knight, and it was Brian Boland and Alan Moore. I guess Watchmen had already come out at that point, right? I know Swamp Thing had it. It's like, okay, this is going to be an incredible comic. It's just like, so I ordered like an insane quantity of them, and then I don't know if you were, I guess you weren't old enough to be buying it then, but it came out with a little dump. It had the Joker. It was a pop-up. They did that for their hot title. They came when each case had its own little pop-up by Alan Moore of the Joker, and I just had it on the front of the cash register at cover price forever. And like, I had it for cover price, and I remember, like, people were like, they're selling it for $5 at odds. I don't care. They're selling it for $10 at odds. Like, I don't care. Like, go buy it for me and sell it to Greg. I don't care. Like, because, like, I bought so many, and I thought it was a good comic, and I just wanted people to buy it. And so, like, I could, like, it's like I remember that because, you know, people made fun of me because I was hyping it so much. Somebody actually did a parody of me hyping that comic with me as the Joker, and then just like left it on the rack, like one of my customers, thinking like I was the Joker, like plugging Killing Joke. I remember that. But then, you know, I think, you know, but the thing was that I really just thought it was good, and so like I never raised the price. I just sold them for $2.95 until they were all gone, and like I had them forever. You know, people just kept coming in and buying them. You know, and same thing with like Spawn #1. I did buy a lot of those because I knew people would want it, and I just never sold it for more than cover price. You know,
that's very benevolent of you. Much appreciated as a consumer. But what else are we missing? Birth of Direct Market, Black and White Explosion. Like what else are we missing?
Well, I mean, but you know, again, the Birth of Direct Market. Just the one part that we missed is like, cause once the Direct Market got into place, you know, and then the comic book stores, and then it created a virtuous circle because there was only these few stores that were selling old comics, and all of a sudden, then people were like, hey, we can get new comics. Then I could just call Phil Seuling, set up an account, and open a comic book store, getting the new comics, and like that's incredible. You know, like I don't have to go to the newsstand, I don't have to do all this rigmarole, and I didn't even have. I mean, this is way back in the day, right? I didn't have a sales tax license. I didn't have, you know, anything, but I could still open an account with Phil Seuling, and I was just buying comics from him and selling them at conventions. You know, and I was definitely speculating like it'd be something to come like, you know, an X-Men, I'll get 50 of that, or you know, I remember definitively the one thing I bought like an insane quantity of was Daredevil 168 because I liked Frank Miller, and then I was like, oh, he's writing this now, introducing a new character, and I bought some insane quantity, and like I had that forever. You know, that was definitely, I was still speculating then. Like I still had them when I opened. I had them for 10 years. That the ones that I bought when it came out that I paid 15 cents for.
Can you tell us a really good dud or two that you might have speculated on?
I only had one super dud. It was like the big dud that like it was my super dud. You know, was the only one was Sonic Disruptors because it came out right after Watchmen, and it was Mike Baron, and it was like rock and roll comics. Like this is gonna be cool, Mike. Like he wrote Nexus, and I really like Mike Baron. But then and I thought this is because it was right after Watchmen, and DC was hyping it as the next Watchmen, and so I bought, and it was a complete bomb. It was a 12-issue miniseries, and they canceled it at 7. It was that bad. Like no one bought it. It was a catastrophe, and so like that was the joke because then Phantom, it's like, oh, what does Bill know? He must be on. And then they bought extras too, and so that was like I was in the, you know, that was like I was ribbed on that for forever. You know, that was my one big mistake. You know, but you know, whatever.
Staple with the quarter bins.
Yeah. I mean, like I'm sure that whatever one, you know, there's still, you know, that was my one super duper dud. But anyway, but like again, you know, the direct market. You know, once all these people are selling in stores, then I guess the first one was Pacific Comics, and again, it's always Kirby, because then Kirby went and did Captain Victory for Pacific Comics because they said, you own it, and Jack is like, I'm up for that, and they want Kirby because he's the man, and so Captain Victory #1 was more or less the first full-color, you know, new direct, you know, creator-owned, specifically created for the direct market, was Captain Victory, and then the Pacific Comics, I think, also did Silver Star, and the Pacific Comics, the Shanes brothers, I think I met at an Atlanta show, because they had been publishing other stuff before that, just under as the Shanes, and I think like Dave Scroggy worked with them, who's still around working for Dark Horse, I think.
See that name in
and yeah, I used to see them at shows, and yeah, so like they started, you know, and they were full color, printed at World Press, you know, the Sparta, you know, all the same stuff, and then that. You know, and then I think, you know, I can't remember exactly if Eclipse was next and then first, and they were doing full color, creator owned. You know, they got Chaikin, you know, they did, and then they with American Flag, and then they had Nexus and Badger, and then Eclipse had Marshall Rogers, you know, did the Foozle, and then they had Eclipse Monthly, and blah 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 blah, and then these were all creator owned, full color, you know, comics that were only sold through the direct market. And so that was when, you know, and then of course then Fantagraphics was doing the black and whites, you know, and then before the Turtles, you know, and then of course Fantagraphics stuff was magazine size too, which was, you know, another differentiator. But then the Turtles was, you know, was comic book size. So, but then there was this whole growth between, I think Captain Victory came out actually like in either 79 or 80 or something. It was pretty early. You know, I can't remember exactly, maybe even 78, but, and so it slowly built. Like Pacific was, you know, definitely was the only one doing it for a year or two, I think, before the other guys came on, because they were looking for the critical mass,
right?
You know, and then of course later on, then it just pumped up. Then you had Image and Valiant, but that's much later. That was after the black and white explosion, and then it was like the same kind of mindset that was doing the black and whites, then was doing the color, and then we're just like, because the market bounced back and there was more money, and then they just threw all that at it.
You've been around for many, many different trends and patterns in these.
Yeah, exactly. It's so interesting. I mean, yeah, the direct market now is kind of fading out, obviously.
We're gonna crack a fresh battery in a second, but
Okay.
before that, because when you lay out Pacific, Eclipse, all of that, it made me think of what must have been like when the earliest manga started coming to America, and you had a shop and you started to see this stuff.
Yeah, well,
like?
well, that was interesting for sure, because there were some people, you know, we had like the phone books, the shonen, you know, and there was a, you know, very small, and then there was shonen, and then there was New Type, that was a magazine about modeling and anime type stuff. But then the first, I can't even remember anymore if Lone Wolf and Cub #1 was the very first, you know, because Lone Wolf and Cub 1, Akira 1, and then My the Psychic Girl 1 and Kamui 1 all came out real close proximity to each other. So Eclipse was, you know, had the My the Psychic Girl and Kamui, and then they had Area 88, and then they moved into doing the, and then did Eclipse do the Rumika Takahashi, like the Lamuretsu and Ramna? I think
they split. I think at that point Viz split, because in the
Viz
beginning
went off
Viz was like
with the Eclipse,
first couple titles,
and then they split. But then First kind of just did Lone Wolf and Cub, and that was kind of it, because they had the Miller thing and then the Sienkiewicz, but it was mostly like Miller. Miller because he was really into it, and then he gave it that big push. And then of course Akira is just in a total class by itself. And then, of course, Marvel colorized it with Steve Oliff, and that was one of the very first computer colors. And they used this. It wasn't quite Baxter, but it was, you know, higher quality stock. And you know, it was all these books were flipped. But we had, you know, again, I was in Wilkinsburg, which had a high, you know, African American clientele who were specific, you know, probably a higher interest than average in manga. And we also had the Hong Kong, like Jade Man, you know, and which had that really interesting printing, and they were actually printed in Hong Kong. And we had one customer, we just called him Jade Man because that's all he ever bought, you know, because he just came in and bought Jade Man. You know, he was a nice guy. I mean,
as a longtime reader, did you have any kind of reaction to those things when you saw them? Like, this is a whole nother avenue, or these are so...
I mean, like anything, I guess, for me, I just like, this is super cool, and I was aware of manga perfectly. I mean, I actually had all along carried the Gen of Hiroshima from those color ones, because those came out way before. That was the first manga, was, you know, Barefoot Gen. I think it was, the comics were just called Gen of Hiroshima, and there were 2, and they were full color, and we always sold those, and those were intense. And I'm, you know, and so I didn't have, you know, any kind of, like, I mean, it was kind of very gradual for me. Like, you know, I thought, oh, this is cool. You know, like anybody else, like the Lone Wolf and Cub, like I came into it, you know, from Ronin, you know, and because Miller obviously was super de-duper influenced. He was obviously reading a lot of manga, you know, all along, going way back. I mean, because once a lot of this stuff got translated and you look at it, you say, oh, Miller looked at that, oh, Miller looked at that, Miller looked at that. I mean, he was super into Japanese culture. I mean, I don't know enough about, like, what his connection was, but he clearly got into that stuff. But then, you know, I just read all the stuff, and like I really responded to. I mean, I like Lone Wolf and Cub for sure, just because of the artwork. But then, you know, My the Psychic Girl with Ikegami's art like really blew me away, and I really liked the story for whatever reason. I just thought it was great. You know, Mai was really big at them, and then of course Akira was the biggest. Like we sold tons of Akira because it was just right at the beginning, and we like this is the greatest thing ever. I mean, it was one of, you know, it was by far the best-selling manga. I mean, it sold. I mean, because I guess I don't know how I managed to keep. I guess it was maybe they were Capital kept extras of that, but I was able to get. I mean, it sold tons. I mean, it was selling at the beginning at least, like, you know, like X-Men or whatever. I mean, maybe even more. I mean, it was one of our biggest selling was Akira. I mean, but the other ones sold really well too. But you know, but that's because I think there were so few, and then once there was a ton, then the per issue suddenly then there was a flood of manga and there was a lot. And so while we still continued to sell probably the same number of comics, maybe a little bit more per month, the number per title obviously went way down. But like it was the second. I sold more Mai than Lone Wolf, but you know, Kira's by far the most, and then Mai. Like Area 88, I didn't like that much. You know, we didn't sell very many. Kamui a little bit, you know, and then the Rumika Takahashi stuff. We definitely always sold her because she was just unique and it was just great, you know. And we sold all that. And it's so funny to look at now because those things were so expensive because some of them, like the Rumiko Takahashi, was probably like, you know, $2.95 for this little black and white thing when comics were like $1, and they were black and white, you know, but we sold them. I mean, because it was it was different. They wanted it, and so
you weren't going to get it. There wasn't like a lower price substitute for
yeah, and it was like, so they were definitely making money off of this stuff for sure, because like compared to now what you pay for manga per page, you know, that stuff was like incredibly expensive. And so, but at some point I think that impacted it. But I mean, manga definitely, you know, we had customers whose that was their number one thing was manga, but you know, for sure, some people just, that became their favorite. Okay, well, I mean, I guess, but we were still all talking about the BEM era. You know, we haven't even entered into the Copacetic Comics era yet. So, I mean, is there anything we still need to cover?
Here's what I'm curious about.
We went to the manga was our last thing.
The black and white implosion then.
Right.
And I think we did mention it about a little bit ago. But what's that look like? Because we're going to talk about a couple bubbles. We're going to get into the 90s, which is, you know, sort of the big cataclysmic one. But the 80s had that implosion moment there, you know, at some point fallout from the black and white explosion. What does that look like from your perspective at the time?
Well, I mean, there was the shake again. Like I had been somebody, even like where we're dealing that the black and white kind of shakeout was like 88, 89, something like that. I can't remember, you know. But at that point, I had already been in the business over 10 years, and of course, a lot of these stores, you know, again, especially with 85, 86, a lot of new stores came in because it was like, it's happening. I'm gonna open a store, and these people didn't necessarily have, you know, I mean, you have to have some kind of basic business savvy, period, like if you were selling a shoe store or whatever, like, you know, the basics. But then other people, you know, might not have known the comics market, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of different variables. And so, you know, at that point I was relatively savvy, and like, I didn't go overboard, you know, and I looked at the numbers. But then, you know, a lot of people, these new people, you know, didn't, because they, like we were saying, you know, the touchstone is, you know, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or even then, you know, like Cerebus was valuable, and then a lot of crazy stuff for a second would be valuable, like Fish Police #1 was like $10, $20, you know, and it was like, you know, it's worth nothing now, you know. And there were other comics, like I'm sure, like for 5 minutes, Adolescent Black Belt Hamsters was $5, and then people were just like, oh, I'm gonna buy, I'm just not gonna remember anymore. But there were lots of ones that were like, maybe this is hot, and I have stuff out in the $5, you know, $5 packs, you know, comics that were once hot, and that of course continues to today. It's the same thing, hot and then crashes, you know. But so people were buying too many, they were speculating. And then there was too much to speculate on, and then you had to make this, you know, you some of it becomes guesswork, and so, and that's, you know, what happened is people just, like, yeah, we already said the domino effect, and so then some stores went out of business, and then but then it cycled, but then it was like, I think what happened then, some of the distributors got winnowed out, and like a lot of distributors, I think, got taken down by the black and white explosion. I mean, you know, I can't remember when it suddenly there was only Capital and Diamond, like literally, but it might have been not too long after that. And so probably from a pure business standpoint, only business, not creative vitality, but, you know, business, having just the two competitors probably made it leaner, meaner, and, you know, more efficient. And then they started, you know, at that point, Diamond and Capital had their own vans, and they started opening up. They were probably just bought out the distributor warehouses of the smaller companies that went under. They probably said, well, help, and then, you know, Diamond and Capital had deeper pockets, or they had a line of credit at the bank, they had a more solid financial position, and so they probably just bought these guys out. And they might have also bought them out at what was a loss, you know, for the distributor that was going out of business. In other words, Diamond and Capital could expand by buying bankrupt distributors for less than they could have if they had been building those warehouses on their own. And they probably got the stock because those guys were distressed fire sale prices, and that enabled them to do that.
One of the famous stories is how Diamond got to be coast to coast is when they bought up Bud Plant's warehouse spaces.
Yeah, because Bud Plant, I guess at that point, was also doing
antiquarian stuff.
Yeah, but Bud Plant still continued to exist, but they got out of the comics part and they're just doing the books.
Yeah, they weren't destroying Iron Man anymore.
Right. And yeah, exactly. And so they probably were able to do that at a really cost-effective thing, and then that gave them stronger cash positions, and then then they had, and I remember they used to not use UPS then. They would have the drivers would come to deliver the books in person.
From Diamond?
Yeah, and from Capital. They would be their own van system, because they had so many warehouses at that point, because there were all these regional people. Like there was Capital and Diamond had Ohio warehouses, and they would just drive a van full of comics to Pittsburgh because it was cheaper to hire, Joe, or Dave was our Capital guy. I remember Dave, and then there was somebody else who had like an unfortunate occurrence, and then he was fired. But Dave was our main guy. But yeah, so he would just drive, and he was just there every week, and here's Dave, we would do it, and yeah, so they drove it themselves. I'm not sure. I think when all the way through the time I closed BEM.
And what's the lifespan of BEM?
BEM itself, depending on how you look at it, the store was 9 years.
So that's
from all the beginning of '86 all the way through till '95. Yeah, and but then BEM had the year before, and then I did BEM as my comics.
Okay, so after moving out of like the 80s.
Okay, and then we had So then anyway, sorry, we got distracted as always. So then I think the business infrastructure with Diamond and Capital was more streamlined, more efficient, and they probably, again, this is a little bit not the kind of stuff that would have been on my mind at all, but somehow this, and then the increased, whatever. Then there was, I can't honestly say, but I mean, obviously, Image had a big part of it. Like something was building in the market at that point, and then Image started, and then there was Valiant, and Valiant was just started doing this whole weird thing where they were pushing it as an investment. There was this whole thing within the comics community of Valiant's a good investment, and they would literally have graphs, and they were literally clearly people from the penny, stock market, where they realized, like, there's nobody doing this in comics. We can fleece these rubes by getting them to invest. What? The story. Later. Okay, but then this was years later. I'll tell a story. But yeah, so people were just, there was a huge push, in speculation on these Image and Valiant and Malibu in particular. And I'm sure there was a couple others, but Image and Valiant were the big two, and then Malibu was. But then these also then. There was somehow more money coming in, and again, this might have been the time, where Marvel was sold, Martin Goodman sold it, at some point, and then I can't remember, but there was like Ron Perlman, I think, owned it at one, and then the bonds were sold, and so there was money, just that sloshing, funds of people who were investing, like money searching for return. And then it just found its way into comics, and when money is searching for a return, it pumps up prices. Like the big thing is like real estate, money, suddenly people say, Pittsburgh real estate, that's where, it's way undervalued. You'll make money in Pittsburgh, and so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Money poured in to buy all these properties, and then all the property prices go up, and that's the big crisis in housing in the United States of America, where people are now homeless because all these money that's searching for return is just buying up all the property and raising the prices. And so there's a real downside to this aspect of American capitalism, but in comics you can see it in a microcosm. And so there was also a baseball card market had imploded, and so there was baseball card money that was looking for a return, and it came into comics. And so really a big part of it was that money poured in, and they backed Valiant, backed Malibu, backed Image. And then the speculators came in, and Wizard was part of that to some degree. And then they were, trying to manipulate the market and blah, 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 blah. But it was really pumped up by investment dollars looking for a return. And so that, tons of comics, Image comics, they were putting $1 million. And of course, then that, the big thing was that, X-Men one, the big Swan song that they printed the 5 covers of, and 7 million copies were printed, and, probably like 3 million of them have never left the still in those original long boxes that the dealers put them in, have never been sold, for sure, right?
Hopefully
and yeah, right. Well, those don't. They're Baxter, I think. Well, maybe the other ones weren't. But yeah, so that was a whole nother level of money coming in that pumped all these books, and there was obviously way too many books, going into the market. And then there's and so that led to the big, 95 implosion, because there's just too much money. Marvel was having problems because they were everybody was just, you know, too much competition. That's when they started putting all these, there was just too much product being produced for the market to absorb. I mean, obviously, if you're printing 7 million X-Men #1s and there's only 400,000 to 500,000 people reading comics, it's absurd, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. And so that, you know, but then the big, you know, huge tactical era of Marvel going exclusive with Heroes World, you know, then that just caused the whole thing to implode in, you know, '95, and it was a disaster. But I mean, I can talk a little bit more about that. But you want to tell those 2 stories I'm going to tell about, like the how, you know, this huge numbers of comics that were being pumped up for investment. One of my friends, I don't know if you want me to tell him who it was, but he went to India. You know, his wife's Indian, and he was in India, you know, within the first decade of the 21st century, between 2000 and 2010, and he was just in some bazaar in India, and there's these huge markets you can imagine from films if you never, and then in this dark warehouse and in the back, and then there was, you know, somewhere, and there's just piles of boxes, and, you know, he's a comic guy, and he's like, what's this? And there were cases and cases of unopened Image comics. They're just like, what do we do with them? We'll send them to India. You know, there was just like, what are we going to do with them? You know, and so there was just such an excess that they're just like, what do we do to send them into this, put them in the, maybe somebody will buy them one day there. And then the second one is that I was called in Copacetic, again, during the first decade of the 21st century, you know, people would call and say they have comics to sell, and I'd be like, yeah, I got like 25 long boxes of comics, and the person passed away, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll totally come and look at them, you know, I mean, it could be interesting, you know, as a guy, an adult, you know, it's like, I'm thinking, like, what could it be, you know, it could be good, and so I went, and then, here they all are, and it was in this room, and there was a whole bunch that they put, and then, here's the rest in the closet, I'll leave you be, and you can go look through them, and I'm getting ready, and a 25 long box collection, and somebody's like, you know, your imagination could be anything, like, what's it gonna be, and I open up the first box, and it's like, what is this, and I was like, I pull it out, and it's like, oh my god, it's just, you know, it's like I'm going through, it's like 50 copies each of Valiant comics, just like, you know, whatever. I was never really into Valiant, so I can't even remember, like you know, Turok. Magnus Robot Fighter, Turok, you know, 7, 50 copies, 8, 50 copies, 9, 50 copies, 10. It's like, whoa, and I open up the next box, and it's like Exo Manowar, 7, 50 copies, you know, and I'm like, and I just go through, I'm like, oh my god, that's all it was 50 copies each of every single Valiant comic that this guy obviously, you know, said, well, I have money, I must diversify my investments, I'll put 2% in comics, because the guy was in the Shayside house that, you know, I didn't feel bad at all, because the guy was obviously, you know, his net worth was, I'm sure, like $1 million or something, because he had a really nice house, I mean, probably more, and so, like, whatever, it was just kind of funny to me that he obviously just read the prospectus of, you know, here's what, wow, if I had invested in this, it was 400% return, that's astonishing, like, I might as well take it, you know, just put my money in these Valiant comics, you know, and so it was, and of course then at that point the people, I just like, and at this point, I mean, maybe now, I'm sure maybe 1 or 2 of those issues had a first appearance or something, but like for me, I was like I have no interest in this, and I just said, you should just put them, you know, I think newspapers still existed then, I said, you should just put a classified ad in and say, you know, whatever 25 long boxes is, you know, like 5,000 mint comics for like, you know, $2,000, you know, and someone will just go, oh my god, and buy them, you know, but like for me, I was the last thing in the world I wanted to do was try to sell 50 copies each of all these Valiant comics. It was all Valiant. Yeah.
It's been incredible going through the Wizards now, looking back on it. It seems like Valiant they were never beyond that stage of just like weird hype. It was always like a shell game. So, you know, the way those things were sold from the beginning, like there's no moment where it's like, oh, they're substantial at this period. It's almost always, it feels like it's just, because there are guys writing columns in Wizard that are also taking out ads selling marked up Valiant comics. The same guy and saying,
well, I mean,
you gotta buy this.
That's totally from, again, the penny stock market. That's the whole thing. Like you pump and dump. I mean, that's the kind of thing that the SEC and the regulators are always. But then these guys are the guys going under the radar. And again, the internet wasn't. You know, this is all pre-internet. I mean, the internet was, I guess, at that point just starting. But these people were all working in an infrastructure that was outside the internet completely, because you know, right. And it would just be like these sheets, and people would just write the review. This next thing is going to be the hottest stock ever. Like, it's incredible. They invented, you know, like. You know, something that will eliminate, you know, you can drink all the alcohol you want and not get drunk or whatever. You'll pass the sober like test, and you know, and and it's just like and people, but then those people will be pumped, you know, and then it's like, get it now for 20 cents a stock, but then they bought it for a penny, and they have 1 million of them, and they're just selling them all to these as they're hyping it, you know. And
the comic shop version of that was like, say for instance, the Mile High Comics catalog would have like a feature where a guy is saying like, you know, coming soon, Magus Robot Fighter for, you know, first time in 25 years, it's coming back. I'm buying at least 100 copies. Like, you know, like
there were a few of those guys that would push it out there. So Bill, you closed your store in '95. Kind of a time of like comic market turmoil. Is that part of why you closed it?
It was complicated. It was definitely part of it because I wasn't sure, you know, what I was going to do. You know, part of it I considered trying to find a buyer for it there in Wilkinsburg, but you know, partially Wilkinsburg at that time, you know, was not an attractive location. You know, I had my clientele. I was comfortable there. I'd been there for 10 years, but other people, I mean, I remember when I do shows, like, oh man, I'd go to a show, like, this stuff's incredible. Like, where, you have a store? Oh man, like, oh, where is it? You know, and then I'd say it's in Wilkinsburg, and they'd be like, Wilkinsburg? Oh, I can't go there. You know, because like Wilkinsburg was just in the media. You know, the media always liked that was sensational, something with this, that, and the other thing would happen in Wilkinsburg. But you know, like I lived in Wilkinsburg. I walked the streets at all times of night. I had my store there. You know, I really did not have any issues in Wilkinsburg. But I mean, it had, you know, whatever, a bad rep.
About the closing of
okay, so anyway, so I, you know, part of it was like, I mean, the main part of it, I mean, to be perfectly honest, like, I was planning on closing the store because I had a daughter, you know, Cassie was born, and, you know, Phyllis had gotten a master's degree, and while I was working, and then she could make more money. It made sense from us as a family for you know, her to work full time, and then to me to be, you know, stay at home with Cassie for a few years, because if I was still running, I mean, I was running the store, I'm there 80 hours a week minimum, and so like, if I'm there 80 hours a week and she's starting a really grueling job, you know, it would be A, super hard for us, you know, and B, you know, not a good environment to raise a real small child, in our opinion. So I was decided that I would close the store or sell it, and I ended up selling it to Phantom, and then because I was this typical subscriber model, you know, and I had a really extensive back issues, and so Phantom took I had like 30,000 back issues that they took, you know, roughly something like that. I mean, I'm pretty sure, and then I had my subscriber list, who then I, you know, obviously couldn't. You know, not all of them went to Phantom, because some of them would go to Phantom in Monroeville or somewhere else closer to where they lived. But you know, a good number went to Phantom, so that was, and I seller financed it to them. And the idea being they got all these comics, and then they got the subscribers, and then the monthly payment that they would make to me would theoretically come out of the money that they were earning from my subscribers alone, in theory, if they had stayed. But I don't, you know, obviously there was definitely going to be attrition, and then they got the comics. But you know, it all worked out. I mean, I'm always grateful for Phantom to you know, for doing that. But I think it was at least of some benefit to them as well, because they, you know, they got that customer base, and then they got the, because Ben was the cool store to some degree, and then Phantom has always, you know, during that whole period when I was here, was clearly the coolest shop in Pittsburgh without any doubt. And then they had, you know. And so I think, you know, being with the students there, you know, they got some of the, and you know, some of the people that worked with me, like Spar, and then my friend Dan Allen, you know, they worked in, so they carried over some of the BEM mojo to Phantom. So I think it was, you know, it was definitely benefited me, and I think it benefited Phantom as well. Benefited
me as a customer, because when I discovered that store, the Love and Rockets comics that I filled a magazine box up with were probably yours from BEM.
Yeah, I'm sure.
There. It's like at the height of the speculator boom, I'm getting tired of Spawn and all of that. I need something else. I go into the back corner where they have, you know, Hate and all that. Start scooping that stuff up, and I'm quite sure it's probably mostly from you, because the culture of the store didn't reflect those 5 boxes that they had in the back there.
Yeah,
yeah, that was great how that store had like their indie corner in the back. You open another store several years later.
Right. Well, then of course, you know, again, it was, you know, propitious to some degree that, you know, that I did close at that moment, but I did see that, like, this is bad, you know, and like I realized, you know, that, you know, and obviously a lot of stores, you know, it was a difficult time for other stores, and so again, I think that the benefit of Phantom having my extra customers would have helped them, and so, and then, you know, then I waited till, you know, once Cassie started going back to school, you know, she was in preschool, and you know, and I did, you know, blah blah blah, and so it was like 5 years, you know, roughly. You know, and then I said, well, I got to go. You know, I wasn't 100% sure I was going to open up a store again. I really wasn't sure. You know, it's like getting. I mean, I guess I don't want to, you know, bore people, but, you know, going home and, you know, being you know, a stay-at-home dad is, you know, quite a change from running a comic book store, and I did my own crazy experimental comics as BEM for those years too, and I was really grateful for the opportunity just to have a chance to do that and express my inner weirdness in comics. And but then, you know, also of course between 95 and 2000, the internet. And you know, it's like, whoa, what's this? Everyone is on the internet. I didn't even have a at BEM. People, Bill, you have to have a computer. Put your comics on an inventory. I'm like, why? They're right there. They're all in order. Why do I need to like put them all in a computer file? It doesn't make any sense. People would always say, you have to have a computer. But then, you know, once the internet came, you know, again, it wasn't like instantaneous, but at some point, you know, it became clear to me that like, oh, the internet is going to completely change everything in the collector market. You know, the big buzzword you know, for the internet was disintermediation. And I realized, you know, for me as a back issue seller, which was a big part of my, you know, DNA as a retailer, because that's how I started for my first years before I opened a store. I was almost all my, you know, income was from back issues. And so I'm the guy being disintermediated, because like people would sell their collections to me and then I would sell them at shows and at my shop. And then all of a sudden, anybody could sell their comics on eBay. And then why would they sell them to me? They can sell them themselves. And that slowly, you know, but again, you know, I saw that, you know, the eBay was changing, you know, specifically, I mean, eBay was the main thing then, you know, for sure. It's going to change the whole fundamental dynamic of back issues. And, you know, because like once you realize, like, you know, if you're a collector, like, oh, I can't find, you know, Fantastic Four, you know, 137, you know, or whatever. I can't find number 12, you know, or everybody's robbing me, you know. Then you just go in the internet and type in Fantastic Four number 12, and like, ding, it's 1 second later, there's several to choose from. And then it's like, once that first, you know, I was like, oh my God, that's like, it took 1 second, you know. And so, you know, then I had to start thinking about that. But the main thing for my first thing was that this is going to change the back issue market. But then the second thing is, the internet has all this potential to create, you know, like I have to be on the internet when I'm creating my next business venture. And so like when I was doing Copacetic Comics, you know, I realized I had to figure out how the internet worked. Like I had to get rudimentary knowledge of HTML, like how do you build a website? What is a website? How do I get a website? You know, what is any of all this stuff? And so like I came, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. So like I learned rudimentary HTML. I got some kind of editors, and I think I worked with Netscape Composer, which was real easy. And you could dump code in and cut and paste, and they had a few buttons. And then I got, you know, some templates, and then I got just a website on Earthlink, because like I think like anybody else, I was like, I guess I'll do AOL, because I've been getting an AOL disc in the mail every day, you know. But then once you put it in, I really like, oh, this is really clunky. I don't like it, and it's expensive. And then like you couldn't turn it off. They had it like it took over your computer, and I had like, how do I stop AOL? You know, I think, you know, but then I guess whatever reason I liked Earthlink, and I went to Earthlink. And then I got their website, and then they had DSL, because everything was dial-up at the beginning. Remember? Do you old enough to remember dial-up? It made all the crazy sounds, and everything was really slow. And then I got DSL through Earthlink, and then I got these websites, and then, you know, I started to build all that, and then I created like I shouldn't talk too much about it, because it's so interesting, you know, the beginning of that. But the big thing was, you know, was the back issues. But then the next thing was like creating a brand, creating a store, being yourself, and, you know, like realize for me, the kind of person I am, you know, I have a relatively strong writing skills, you know, and I just started doing all these. I realized all these different things you could do with the website. Like I created the Copacetic Gallery. I had a BEM archives where I stored all the stuff from BEM. At the very beginning, I had like a radio station, and then I had the Fairvale thing that I had been doing with Frank as the comic, and that kind of had petered out. So I said, I'll make it a website, you know, and I'll turn it, you know, just all these interesting things, you know. And this was obviously, again, this period before social media came into being, and people just went to websites. And so I started writing about comics and putting this stuff in, and like I think began because I had a chance to start afresh at this point, and I created a whole new business plan that I created for Copacetic. You know, part of it was because I recognized what the internet meant for retailing, and, you know, again, I guess I don't know. I mean, I could talk about this for a really long time, but because of what happened in the '95 implosion, you know, you know, if you ever read my mission statement, it was kind of written around that time originally. I think I wrote it in '96, and I just recognized that, you know, the direct market was in trouble, and like and again, the kind of the cliche easy way to say it is like, you know, it's not 100% accurate. It's like this, the death spiral of people only went to comic book stores, who already went to comic book stores, who already collected comics, and were only going to buy the stuff they already knew about, and only buy the stuff that they liked. And it became, you know, more and more, ingrown or whatever. It was just less creativity in the direct market, because at that point then there was only Diamond. There was this one funnel, and like, who's going to come to a comic book store who? And again, this is before the movies started to make a bigger impact. Or just people who already know comics, and it just seemed to me it was just going to get less and less diversity of content in a smaller and smaller audience until it would implode. It was my, pessimistic fear. And so I felt, one of the things, like comics are my main thing, my passion in life, and I want comics to survive. The comics, are such a great medium, blah 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 blah. That's why we're all here. And so when I created Copacetic, partially again awareness of the internet, I wanted to create a store model in which comics were situated as a medium or in a form of expression in the context of all other forms of expression that you could buy in a store. So I had books, I had poetry, I had art, I have film on DVD and music on CD, and like I had DVD, even though VHS was dominant at that point, and DVD was new. So I was going to be bold and only sell DVDs. Now, of course, DVDs are dead, and so in other words, I had music, cinema, comics, literature, poetry, art. You could get it all at the same. And the point was, like, comics are, to me, I was just like, comics are just as good as any of that. They're just as valid a medium as any of the others. Like, I wanted, again, busted out of the ghetto, as the saying, people say the ghettoization is a term that was used for fandom because it was just over there. It's something separate. Only certain kind of people read comics. And that was somewhat true. The comic book store, that was this thing. I mean, people wore it as a badge of honor, of course, but my goal was I wanted to say comics are just as good. I mean, there's every bit as valid. Like, comics can, there's no reason the comics should be a pejorative, and that was my goal. Right.
This is the time whenever I met you,
right,
in this time period, and that's something I always associate with you, is sort of that idea of comics as, I guess, equal media, equal form. But that wasn't, that's a thing I think maybe young readers take for granted now because of where the status.
Oh yeah, well, for somebody like me, like,
it was revolutionary from my childhood.
Yeah, like for someone like me, like my dream, even when I was at BEM, I would be in the basement, and I was just like, why couldn't you have like a comic that like Gertrude Stein would write in, and then Picasso would paint it? Like, why not? Why couldn't you have like a poetry and a painter do comics, and they would have some, like, why couldn't somebody do anything? You could be, and of course, like Crumb was obviously, somebody who saw that, when he did Zapping, he was the first person to recognize that he drew every single line, and that a comic book was a work of art. Like when he did that, that was his big He's like, look, I created this. It's a work of art that I completely created, because up to that point, comics were always commercial. It was always like, it was something that you sold and you made money off, and it was like, it was a secondary offshoot that it happened to be great. That's Spiegelman's famous quote that comics are the bastard child of art and commerce. But the Crumb thing was just like, it was just purely him expressing himself using the comic as his medium of expression as an artist, period. And so, and of course there's, others have done that, but that was the clear statement. And but then all the things that, like, I mean, comics could, I was always like, comics can be anything, but like, why it was just so limited. And again, a lot of people think of comics wholly mistakenly as a genre, and it's like, no, comics is a medium, comics is a form. Superheroes are a genre, funny animals are a genre, western, science fiction, detective, horror, those are genres. Comics is a medium, and it can embrace anything, and it can be literary, it can be poetry. Like, there's this magazine called Ink Brick, right? And it's comics poetry. I think that's their, you can be, anything. And so, like, what's finally, again, in 2000, when I was, doing Copacetic, I think it was, definitely, it was starting to percolate, a little bit more, but then I think in the course of the first decade, comics were much more accepted. Again, like, famously, Clowes did Art School Confidential. Like if you were somebody who wanted to do comics and you went to art school, you were laughed at as being ridiculous and infantile and puerile and blah blah blah. But then 20 years of struggle later, now people are going to art school and comics are something that they'll learn in college, or they'll decide to take their art practice and apply it to comics. And there's people from art school doing comics, and of course now there's actually comics programs like at SCAD, and then in other schools actually have comics programs, and of course there's Center for Cartoon Studies that only teaches comics, and they have an MFA and a 2-year certificate, and so all this stuff just was pie in the sky back in the 80s, and it's all really happened since 2000, and it's amazing, right? But I mean, again, I think when I opened Copacetic and when I was formulating it in 2000, I mean, this was just at the inkling at the beginning of that.
Did the brick and mortar open in 2000?
No, it opened. I think I put the website in 2000, and then the brick and mortar was in 2001, at the beginning of 2001. And then I guess, just to talk a little bit more, but I mean, for the website worked very well for me because I put a ton of content on. And I even had this thing where I did the Daily Davis, and I did a drawing every day and just put it up, like do traffic. And I was really into creating a lot of content. And again, this was before social media. There was very few comic book stores that had anything approaching the kind of content that, I didn't put it up right away, but by 2002, 2003, 2004, I was putting a lot of content on the site and writing reviews. And like, again, I had the, what's it called, the stat counter for where it would tell you how many distinct visitors, how many page hits, how many minutes per page, how many minutes spent, blah blah blah. And my my traffic went like this, and then it went skyrocketed when because I had so much content, and then it went up really fast over a period of like 2 years, and then it went incrementally up for maybe another 2 years, then it plateaued for 2 years, and then it's been in total decline ever since, because around then everybody started to migrate to social media towards the end of the first decade, but I mean, I had incredible traffic on my website because, and I also immediately recognized right away that Google was the better search engine, and I read all about Google and how they did their algorithms for, and I did all the search terms, and then I got people and then the linking to it and this and that, and I had super high. I had lots of stuff where certain combinations, a lot of things where I would be the top back then. Like, I mean, so many. And so I had a huge amount of traffic, and I didn't even have a shopping cart yet. I just did it all on the phone or email, and people would send me credit cards in an email, which and I just I say don't put the V number or the expiration. Send me that in a different email. I don't know if any of that mattered, but as far as I know, no one got hacked.
Let's say Copacetic is now established. The brick and mortar is now established. Can we take a little bit of the narrative back to DC? Bethesda, Maryland specifically.
Okay.
Because I've always identified you as one of the really smart retailers, and this is so crucial nowadays with Kickstarter projects and Indiegogo projects, all this kind of thing. But at Small Press Expo, Bethesda, Maryland, you were one of few retailers, maybe 5 or 6, that I would see on the floor who was buying stuff from people who were not distributed in the big magazines and stuff. Is that something that you've always done, or when you open Copacetic, it's like, I need to start stocking this thing?
Let's expand that question.
Yeah,
so the question might be like, how do you stock this store? Because we know you don't have a Diamond account, maybe you have access to it a little bit through Phantom, but we live in this time where there's so much material. So like, how do you stay abreast of it? How do you stock this stuff? How do you keep up with it? I mean, you're buying, well, you tell us, but I know that you buy some directly from artists.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So,
well, I mean, again, I guess just to real briefly, I've always been interested in promoting smaller independent stuff. Even when I very, very first started in the 70s, like I carried like Star Reach, and it's particularly in the Gary Friedrich the Ground, and then I carried some of the undergrounds. But I really liked the fact that they were different, not Marvel, DC, and I carried like some of these small like presses from New England that did archival things and blah blah blah. So I always and I even put out my own fanzines, in DC. Like they were horrible, but I did. So I've always liked that, and even to BEM, I always obviously I published the Transformer comic, which was all local people. I did 20 issues of that, and then I did the 2 issues of No Comics, which had Frank Santoro's first comics and 2 other guys, Tom Reynolds and Rick Mays, who, Rick went on to a pretty successful career for a while there. And so, like, I've always, and of course, then when Fangraphics started, I was, like Love and, like I said already, like Love and Rockets was the #1 thing I would, and 8 Ball, et cetera, et cetera. And then obviously when Drawn and Quarterly came, I was super big fan of, of Chester Brown and Yummy Fur and Dirty Plot, and the Drawn and Quarterly is its, flagship Drawn and Quarterly title, and all those, I was always focused on that, always. Like, that was my favorite stuff because I liked it the best. And it was more towards what I thought you could do with comics. And so anyway, once I started Copacetic, then there was, smaller, it definitely became a challenge. Like, where do I get all these small things that were coming out? And SPX was definitely, it had already started then. So I went right away, and that's where I met, I met like Kevin, like right at the beginning, I met Kevin Huizenga and Dan Zetwalk were when I saw Kevin Huizenga's Gloriana comics, which was Super Monster 12, 10, 13, I think. 14. I can't, 13 maybe?
14, I think.
Yeah, 14. It's funny, but anyway, when I read that, I was like, oh my God, this was a total, like, a self-published mini comic can be a work of genius. And just like, I was like, this is a work of genius. It's incredible. And I was like, that was the thing that, I would buy those. I got it from him at SPX, and then I kept buying them from him over and over again. I need 20 more. Send me 20 more. And then I would, because it was $3, I would force everyone to buy it. And Dan Zetwalk had that Ironclad, I think, and he was Dan's strength was the tactility and the funkiness and his constructive. He had a very, craft-oriented type. In his were the work itself, the way he put them together. Most famously that Telltales that was the actual punch card was the comic. And when you read the comic, it's like genius that it's a punch card because it's the end of the analog. It's the transition because it was actually thrown out because everything's digital, and it's just like it'll be in a museum one day. And so yeah, I would meet these people at SPX, establish contact, buy them directly from them at the shows, and then obviously through email. And then those guys did the USS Catastrophe, which was an early distro. And then I can't remember, Jesse Recklaw had another. There was a West Coast distro that I can't remember the name of.
Hobo Mojo. Something
no, Hobo Mojo was me. I had Hobo Mojo, but he had Hobo something else. But yeah, something Hobo.
Global Hobo.
Global Hobo.
That's
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my thing. Before Copacetic, I was like, Hobo Mojo. I did some prints and things like that. I was like, I think with Frank, that was all the stuff we were into. When he was doing Storyville, like Hobo. I like that Hobo Mojo. It was just dumb, but Anyway, yeah, so I would meet people directly. SPX was a great resource because it was, especially back then, the quality of the work. Then I remember, Anders Nilsson, Jeffrey Brown, John Hankiewicz. So these are people I remember meeting right away who I was really thought, you're all doing great work. And I'm sure there was others. I met Eleanor Davis real early. She was making some real fun. I remember she had stuff. I think she was selling her comics out of a gumball machine. I'm pretty sure that was her. And then she had ones like she put them in the oven so they would be old, and just there was. And then Hope Larson, who's now more of a writer, but she made some really nice, super crafty comics. And then there were those guys from Norway who were all in yellow. I can't remember that group. I wish I could remember their name, but they were like a squad of these guys, strapping men from Norway who did their crazy
Vikings.
comics. Yeah, and they came. Yeah, they really had that. It was like the Hives, if you remember them. That band, they kind of presented a little bit like that. They were great. A lot of insane level of energy. And then I would literally order their comics then from Norway, and they would send them to me. And yeah, so that was a great way to network, and I would just connect with everybody, and I would buy. And one show, then I kept doing that more. I can't remember one show, and then one show I lost my mind, and I said I'm going to buy the entire show, and then I would bring it back to Copacetic, and people would know because I've been doing it for a few years, and I would just bring stuff back, and then I'd be like SPX at Copacetic, and then literally it was the only day of the year where people would wait outside. To open, because that never happened at my shop ever, except for this, because people knew I might have like 3 of some of these things. So I can't buy huge quantities of everything, and people are like, "What'd you get?" and go through and buy the stuff. And so I did that for years. But like the one year where I bought everything, and then I wrote this huge. I would write these pages on the website like SPX and here, and I wrote, and it went on and on. and I just like, you know, and a lot of it, a lot of it I didn't sell, and B, it was so much work that I burned out that year. And then it was, you know, it was just like anything else. That was the peak, and I still did it, but then like after that year, I did it less. And then I think that led eventually to doing Pix, which was obviously more or less an imitation of SPX for Pittsburgh in 2010. And so at that point, then I felt I was doing my duty. I no longer had to import SPX, you know, like my duty, you know, like that duty has fallen from me. But now that I'm bringing my own show here, that was, you know, and so I think I kind of stopped doing that after starting to run Pix, because like it's effectively better, right? I mean, to have a local show like that, and then we would bring some of the exhibitors, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, going to SPX, buying from them, meeting the people. And then, of course, at some point I became known as the guy who would do this, and then people would email me saying, would you carry my comic? And they would mail me a comic or send me an email. And then, of course, then it, you know, did consignment. You know, some of the stuff that I bought 10, 15 years ago, I still have.
Yeah.
You know, like some of it just, you never sell, or if you get 5, you've sold 3, and you still have 2, et cetera, et cetera. So I have thousands of these small zines still in the store, you know. And then, of course, at some point, too, then, you know, I was literally, you know, contacting people, emailing, buying direct, and then there was a few, you know, there was the USS Catastrophe, or there was the Global Hobo, but then I'm sure there was a couple other people that I'm going to forget, but obviously John Porcellino came back with Spit in Half, Birdcage Bottom came together, there was, then Tony Shenton would rep people, where he would forward the emails, and I would just order through Tony, and then, of course, I still had to do it one at a time and pay, and I'm sure there's some other. And then, of course, Last Gasp still had some of these people, especially the West Coast people, would, like Kramer's I got through Last Gasp. I mean, Sammy, Kramer's 4, I bought a stack of them from him at the show, but then after that he said, just get them from Last Gasp. And I actually remember at the end, he said, how many do you have left? And so, we only have like 14 left. I'll take them all. You know, I bought the last ones, you know. And then, so I did buy from, you know, Last Gasp did have some of the cool stuff. They had the Jordan Crane thing also. I mean, some of the better small press, you know, artier stuff Last Gasp did handle. I mean, I got Lolly Westman some of her stuff even from Last Gasp. So they were still in the game, you know, like also. But so the fact that these, and then there was, my fantasy is that there'll be more of these, you know, but again, it's so hard to make money for those distro guys. I'm sure, I mean, John, there's probably people who follow him know that he was kind of burning out on Spit in Half. It was becoming too much for him, and so he scaled it back. But then I recently said he was hoping he thinks he might have someone who will help him. You know, that would be, you know, especially if someone could take it over, because I mean, again, I obviously know how much work it is, because he's fulfilling individual orders on top of doing the distro. You know, it's incredible. I mean, I do mail order every day, and it's a lot of work. And he still obviously is trying to do comics, which I am not trying to do. I am trying to do, but failing miserably, having done one comic in the last 19 years. Yeah, so I mean, the hope is that, you know, it would be like, you know, somehow somebody would be a more stronger distro for all this press, but it's like, I don't know if that's realistic. Now, of course, on the other hand, you know, we didn't discuss at all is the huge influx of the New York book publishers into graphic novels. So, I mean, obviously there was Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly have been there the entire time, and then Koyama came along. It was real strong, and before Koyama was Picture Box, and Picture Box was incredible. I sold tons of Picture Box, and they were, you know, amazing. But, you know, then they didn't, you know, they went bankrupt because they had, you know, for a variety of reasons. But then the New York book publishers have had, you know, obviously, you know, Random House owns Pantheon, and they put Mouse as a, you know, stellar, huge hit, and then they had a massive sales with Persepolis, which is a huge hit, and then I think Henry Holt, you know, kind of out of the blue, struck gold with Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which was just a mega seller. I mean, it was, you know, done. Time Magazine gave it the book of the year, not just the graphic novel of the year, you know. And then Are You My Mother, you know, obviously was really strong follow up. But, you know, Fun Home, I'm sure it was sold in the millions. I mean, it must have, or at least $1 million. I would presume, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, it's sold so many. I mean, it still just sells and sells and sells. You know, just like Black Holes, you know, sells and never stops selling. You know, and then Chris Ware never stops selling. You know. And so then there's so many other, then there's First Second, which is a subsidiary of a larger, I mean, I can't remember if it's owned by Macmillan, yeah, but, you know, they have huge print runs, and, you know, have the incredible distribution. They're in every bookstore, you know, and then they're the digest size, and they're got the Target, you know, and then there's, you know, SBS, which has the Harry Potter, millions and millions of dollars, an incredible muscle that, you know, Raina Telgemeier, you know, that Smile, she was selling those at SPX for a quarter.
Oh, yeah.
These little mini comics, and then Smile has sold 1 million copies through SBS, and then Bone, which was self-published, goes through SBS, and I don't know if they sold 1 million, but, you know, obviously huge seller, you know, through the younger reader market there.
When it comes to you, I guess this means you have to look at even more distributor catalogs and have more accounts at other places.
Yeah. For me, I'm probably like, you know, like insane. Like again, like yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how many other people could do what I do, just because I think I built up space in my brain. And the sad thing is, I've forgotten everything about my own life. Like what's happened in my life, I don't remember, because my entire memory is filled up with like who distributes what comic, and, you know, and where it is on the shelf, and, you know, because I deal with so many different distributors, and I deal direct with a lot of publishers, you know, as I can. I deal direct with creators whenever I can, but then, you know, sometimes, I mean, again, there's a formula that's just buried in my mind that I'm not even fully conscious of, that determines, you know, like when it's better to just you know, when I can just agglomerate it through a single distributor order. Sometimes I'll order just because I need to have it in stock the next day. I'll get it from Ingram if Ingram has it, or I'll order it from a distributor. A lot of people now, Ingram bought Perseus, which owns Consortium, which is the really strong comics with people like Secret Acres, even something like Secret Acres, Uncivilized, Koyama. You know, in Nobel, I used to go through Consortium, but now they're bigger and they're going through Random House. But, you know, so I mean, I'm sure there's other ones I'm spacing on, but, you know, Secret Acres, Uncivilized, yeah, and Floating Worlds, you know, these are fairly small outfits, but they're now available directly to me online through Ingram, where I can just order them with a push of a button. You know, the Ingram is an incredibly efficient, high quality, you know, interface on the web. They give you real time, you know, the numbers of everything, what's available in every warehouse every second. You know, if somebody orders it, if, you know, it says 13, and then I'll look, I'll go back, oh, now it's 11. Somebody just bought 2 in the last 5 minutes. I mean, you know, it comes the next day if it's in the Pennsylvania warehouse. You know, it's amazing. And so, you know, that allows me, because I stock so many things that even having one extra copy of everything in the store is impossible. You know, so I only have things that there's a chance I'm going to sell. You know, obviously new releases are something totally different, but as far as the shelves go, I don't have backstock on most of this stuff, except for something like Black Hole or Uzumaki or you know, Fun Home, or something that I might sell 2, you know, in one day, or something like somebody about, like, I sold 2 Uzumakis on Sunday in 1 hour, you know, just like, or 2 hours or whatever. You just never know, because that's one that just, and so like I keep 2 of that in stock. But if I literally couldn't possibly, but because Ingram has so many of these books, you know, that whole thing you hear about in manufacturing, like just-in-time delivery, lean manufacturing, because they, you know, everything, they build these cars and they're coming from Windsor, you know, Canada, you know, they're building them, and then there's nothing in the factory until the day that they, you know, need to put it on the car, you know, and it's just this huge, because, and that makes for incredible efficiencies, and that's part of the whole magic of the internet. I mean, but so in other words, I have a bazillion different sources. You know, and again, from the tiniest, you know, when I do consignment, people in Pittsburgh, they just come in with their comic bill. Here's my new comic. You know, Nate famously, you know, here's the new Grixley, you know, and I'll just put it up, you know, and then that's that. So I have a lot of people who just bring their comics in. I have people who I contact through email, people who contact me through email. I have people I order through Instagram now sometimes, and then I get them through the small distros like Birdcage Bottom and Spit in Half, and Floating Worlds has a distro also, and I'm sure there's somebody else I'm not thinking of, and Tony Shenton. And then I deal directly with Random House, I deal directly with Macmillan, I deal directly with, you know, Hachette, you know, which distributes Marvel, you know, and Random House distributes DC, and you know, Hachette distributes a lot of other stuff besides. They distribute Self-Made Hero, and, you know, of course I also buy books from these people because I'm a bookstore too. So I, you know, and then I deal with Ingram, and then Ingram, I used to deal direct through Perseus and Consortium, but now Ingram bought them, and so that really makes that all one interface. So Ingram just has everything, you know.
You mentioned, you know, in the 90s, you kind of saw the internet and saw this vision for how it would affect retail, and particularly your business.
Right.
I wonder if there any observations you have now in terms of what you expect to see in the next 5 to 10 years.
I mean, the future, I don't know. I mean, the key thing, I guess, if we're, talking about the future, I mean, obviously the thing that's happened in the last 10 years that wasn't there in the first 10 years is that social media rules everything now. I mean, like Facebook and Instagram. I mean, there was that whole era where Tumblr was the go-to, and Tumblr was amazing, and everybody was tumbling, and then I did I could put something on Tumblr, like, I got this super find. I remember I put something up, I got it, especially if I had some deal I got, people would tumble, and I'd sell them all in 1 second, but then that died, but then, Facebook is kind of this, become an ever more problematic entity because they on Instagram also, and so, social media I'm kind of hoping that this is the peak, the acme of social media, and now it's going to go into decline, being replaced by something else, but I have no idea whatsoever what's going to happen. But just like Tumblr like faded pretty fast. You guys were on it, right? I mean, didn't it kind of? Just everybody went to Instagram or something?
Yeah, it's the culture. You never want to go to the club that your mom goes to.
Or whatever. Well, everybody's on Facebook, though. But nonetheless, not
young kids aren't.
Young kids aren't on. Yeah, they're on WhatsApp or whatever. But yeah, it's true. Like the real young kids, you're right. I'm sure you know much more about that than I do. But anyway, so social media. This was the decade of social media, and so like the next decade, and so like as a business, it's like real hard not to be on social media, like because then people don't remember who you are. Like if I never posted on Facebook and never posted on Instagram, so great a percentage of people's time on the internet is spent on these platforms that if you're not on it at all, I mean, I think you could risk being forgotten. And so but then I'm just, for myself personally, I'm just thinking of like I have been forced to spend, it's called it colonize my business, colonize some of my time, and I feel like my business, like I was like Copacetic Comics, the country of Copacetic, and then Facebook and Instagram were like, haha, we must do fealty to us because we are your new overlords. It has that weird kind of feeling, and I'm just like, I kind of sort of slippery slope, and then I'm just like, no, I'm not enjoying this like as much as I used to, and it's just like, I feel like it doesn't feel right. It feels like work. And of course, in the back of my mind, being a business person, haven't done this for all these years, you see like, wow, well, Google and Facebook have incredible stock market valuations, and the owners of Google and Facebook are, millionaires and billionaires. Like, where is all this money coming from? It's coming in part from, really where it's coming from is that everybody who puts content on that is doing it for free. And then that creates the ecosystem, and then of course they get money from advertising is where the dollars come from, but the reason that they're able to charge for the advertising is that everybody's on there putting all their content on it and spending the time on it, and then they're exploiting all that time and energy that people have put to build these things into selling the ads. And so in other words, I feel that all this extra work that I'm doing, being on Facebook and Instagram, etc., is making money for the shareholders of Google and Facebook, not for me, because I'm not making any more money. I'm just doing it because like I'm afraid if I don't do it, I'll make less money because I'll lose all my customers because they'll forget about me because they're all on social media. And so I feel less and less enthusiastic about social media because of the amount of work I'm doing. And I feel so I'm hoping that I mean, again, like I don't have any answer, but in my back of my mind, I'm thinking about alternatives and options to that, because when I think back, I really did enjoy I had the glory days for me were like 2001 to like 2006 or 7 when I just had so much internet traffic, and it was a lot more fun, and I enjoyed building the stuff, and like I was creating a large site and had a lot of traffic, and I got a satisfaction of seeing like how many people were just coming to my website, and that people were reading the reviews, and I could see things, and I like so, but I honestly have no crystal ball for the future, but like I have the experience of seeing the past, that maybe the information I'm sharing, someone who's younger and has more savvy about what's going on now could go like, because again, history repeats itself. Those who don't pay attention to history, blah, blah, blah. And so like I have a good sense of history, but I'm so old now that I think I don't have a good sense of what's coming at all. I got to be honest. So, I mean, I'm not the person to look for the future, but I am somebody who's a good resource in the past. So,
Bill, we've been talking so long that the lighting outside is shifting focus and shining brightly in your eyeballs, man. So we should probably cut out here pretty soon, but not before you let everybody know the website URL, the name of the store. The Kayfabe effect is real, so be prepared to do a lot of work once you drop this URL or whatever.
Well, I mean, at Copacetic Comics, obviously, the key is knowing how to spell copacetic, which is a word, but it's COPACETIC, and then it's copaceticcomics.com. And somewhere we have on our website, like, what's copacetic mean anyway? We have a whole history of the word copacetic, and that's part of the vibe that copacetic is about, is the meaning and history of that particular word. But yeah, I mean, you check out our website. I mean, we, again, like, we don't have a diamond account. We sell like, our website probably has no Marvel or DC comics on it unless they're by Ed Piskor or Jim Rugg, or soon Tom Scioli, I suppose. And yeah, so we have a lot of stuff that you won't find elsewhere. And I think there's some thoughtful reviews, and then we have a link page although some of the links are woefully out of date. But there's a lot of material. If you go to the Copacetic universe, on the Copacetic site, there's links to, like, the Copacetic Gallery, the Daily Davis, Fairvale. There's a link to our old school site, which I still maintain, which I think the URL for that, I think if you type in copcomco.com, it still goes to the old website.
Right off the tongue.
Right, yeah, that was my original one. And so there's a lot of material on there. If you were interested in the things I was saying, or what have you, there's a lot of writing. The website, there's 19 years of stuff on those various websites, so it would be a lot of stuff up there.
And those links are directly below this video. People could click them, easy peasy. And I think in the past 2 hours, we've clearly illustrated many of the fine points that addresses the fact that this is probably one of the coolest comic shops in the world, and people are going to come across some things that they didn't know that they needed. So, Bill, Jim, I don't know if you have anything?
No, just thank you very much, Bill. You've sort of been a source of wisdom for me for the last 20 years, so I'm excited to get you on this channel and to share some of this insight with our followers. Okay, well, I mean, comics, again, like, comics, obviously I've been 42 years, I've been, selling comics and reading them for over 50 years, and so I feel comics are a great medium, and it's, it's really valuable, and I really hope that it'll grow and embrace anything in the world, any kind of material can be comics. It should embrace every kind of diversity of people and art forms and perspectives and types of writing, types of drawing. Sky's the limit, because it's just words and pictures together can be anything. And so comics are really just can be something I hope have a great future as a mode of expression and a medium. I think we may have only scratched the surface. There's a lot to come. Thank you.
I'm going to make a prediction. I think that you're going to charm the pants off of people with this shoot interview that we just recorded. So I'm going to cut the camera, go put this thing online right away. But we might have to do this again in the future, Bill.
All right. Well, I guess if you think I have another 2 hours worth of gabbing, like I feel, I don't have to talk for 2 hours. You could talk for way more than 2 hours.
Thanks again, Bill.
Okay.